And here we are again. Good evening and welcome to Tales and Cocktails. Excuse me, my dears. Tonight, rather than one story, I'm going to present, in essence, a potpourri. Several pieces, some very short, that I'm fond of and I would like to share. So, our first one is by, here it is, by Arthur Marshall, and it's entitled, Stop It at Once. Excuse me. Life in a boys' public school a half-century ago was a little short on scheduled enjoyments, but at the house, one of 12, that I was in, the headmaster did treat us all at pleasantly recurring intervals to sensational moral lectures of a prolonged and fascinating nature. We found them totally electrifying, for he was a brilliant speaker, had obviously conscientiously prepared his material, and was quite unaware that, to young people, he was a hilarious figure. Every so often after evening prayers, he would stand up and, speaking without notes, let fly. As a new boy, I couldn't always understand why he was so concerned and what had gone wrong. Had somebody perhaps said, drat, or been rude to matron, or left some gristle, or smiled at a boy older or younger? You couldn't smile at a boy in another house at all. And as I was by nature an inane smiler, I was at constant risk. But as time went on, I began to get the hang of the affair and the gist of the matter, and hung upon the housemaster's words. Later in the day, to be so splendidly mimicked by wags as we disrobed, shrieking for bed, and cackled ourselves into the land of Nod. One of the most memorable pejors, delivered during a power cut, but with flickering candlelight, rendering it even more, so to speak, electrifying than usual, began with the striking phrase, "This house is a midden," followed by a dramatic pause, which the dimmer boys tried to work out, just what a midden was, and if so, what might be the matter with it. On another occasion, we were told that the trouble lay neither at the top of the house, where the prefects were, nor at the bottom of the house, but in the very middle of it. And a most pious boy, later a distinguished academic and now high up and highly respected in the church, anxiously totting up on the house list, found that out of 63 boys, he was the 32nd, precisely in the middle, and therefore at the very seat of the bother, and deplorably culpable. Other pleasantly recurring treats, also of a mainly moral kind, were the regular weekend visits to the school of the then Bishop of London, dear old, kindly old, indubitably wonky old Winnington Ingram, much loved by all. He preached, of course, in our chapel on Sunday, and after pronouncing the blessing at the altar, swung round and dexterously extracted from his billowing canonicals a large gold watch and had a deco at the enemy. And indeed, he was operating on a tight time schedule, for as soon as the service was over, he repaired to our Natural History Museum, which stood close by, and there, unsuitably seated among pressed grasses and cases of spread-eagled moths and the skeleton of a singularly unattractive horse, he received any boy who cared to call on him solo, and very many did, for a little moral uplift and spiritual encouragement at 2 minutes flat ahead, though the more personable boys could usually count on a few seconds longer. A warm, soft, and somewhat clinging handshake concluded the interview. Then he was up and away to a nourishing repast with the headmaster at schoolhouse. Once a boy had once written home, "We had beef for lunch today." the headmaster calved. And after that, at 2:30, 3 school prefects appeared to make up a 4 at tennis with the bishop, a lively player who liked to win and whose wild rushes to the net with a loud screech of "Mine, partner!" seemed to be in no way slowed down by the fact that he always played in enormous elastic-sided brown boots. When this delightful cleric was not at Oundle, the newspapers kept us in touch with his doings and activities, one of which was to protest. If there was anything morally unworthy going on, and ideal stuff for protesting about, there was the bishop, piping up too. He took against, for some not very clear reason, a play called The Sacred Flame. Doubtless the word sacred upset him, as the flame part meant love, of course, and the illicit love in the play was far from sacred. So protest he did, to the great profit of the newspapers, and even more so of Gladys Cooper, who played the lead, and of Somerset Maugham, who had written it. Boosted by the bishop, the theatre was jammed for months with titillating playgoers and envious theatre managers pressed free seats on him, hoping that he might unearth something and be inspired to protest about Rosemary or Peter Pan or Where the Rainbow Ends or George and Margaret. And now, bless me, here he is again after all these years, popping up as fresh as paint and hot on the track of filth. His wails and strictures now resurrected in Edward Briscoe's admirable Vice and Vigilance, a fine panorama of the various purity movements in Britain. I hadn't fully realized how good the bishop's track record was. In the whole 38 years of his London incumbency, he never once missed a meeting of the Public Morality Council's subcommittee on brothels. The air thick with... He kept the Home Secretary on his toes. I took him in 21 filthy books and followed them up with a cartload of saucy magazines, light reading that was probably an agreeable change from the official boxes. He spoke out rather unfairly against plump ladies in flesh-colored tights, displaying themselves with not a follicle of pubic hair in sight in music hall tableaux vivants. In 1934, he announced in the Lords, muddle-headed to the last, that he would like to make a fire of all contraceptives and dance round it. In those brown boots again. We remember Macaulay's verdict that there is no spectacle so ridiculous as the British public in one of its periodic fits of morality. Last century's fit was a longish one. There was an agitation to clothe with what? Bloomers? Jockstraps? Some nude statues in the Strand. Sellers of obscene toothpick cases were ruthlessly tracked down and spoken to. Purity workers, armed with lanterns, lurked at the doors of brothels to identify the customers, subsequently writing up their names on walls. Then the ladies were invited to leave their work a while and come to church. Male Salvationists were warned never to kneel down with women at midnight meetings, especially behind a pew. Tea was served. Nosegays were handed out by the Bible Flower Mission, and as soon as dawn broke, there was a group photograph, smile please, followed by breakfast. Everybody got very worried and panicky about white slave traffic and crate loads of drugged and insensible womanhood getting shipped abroad. Abductors, clutching hypodermic syringes, were said to haunt the most unlikely places. Barnet, Banbury, Finsbury Park, waiting to pounce and whiz servant girls off to Buenos Aires. Beasts in human shape were alleged to rig themselves up as clergymen and with attractive offers lure maidens to the capital. Dear child, you're going to love the British Museum. The West Ham area was evidently an unexpectedly fruitful supplier of moon-faced girls ripe for Marseille, and even as late as 1913, the 5,000 girls of London's telephone exchanges were given official warnings to watch out for drugged chocolates. Just the one violet cream or strawberry surprise, and everything might go black. And next, this is by Auberon Waugh, and it's entitled Granny Grace. Granny Grace was in fact my step-great-great-great-grandmother, widow of my great-great-grandfather, the 10th Lord. I guess I put in another great there. She was my step-great-great-grandmother, widow of my great-great-grandfather. That makes sense. The 10th Lord Wemyss, whom she married in 1900, when his lordship was already 82 years old. Hers was the first naked female form I saw. In old age, she did not lock the bathroom door when she had a bath, for fear that she should fall down or suffer a seizure. At the age of 3, I wandered into her bathroom on a general tour of inspection. Having studied her agitated form for a few minutes, I said to her, or so she afterwards claimed, "How beautiful you are looking today, Granny Grace." It was exactly the right thing to say, of course. I would like to think that the experience helped me in later years in my relations with women. Now, yes, let us skip over to David Niven. Where is David Niven? This is entitled The Fancy Dress Ball. And if you know of David Niven's writings, you know he's really quite wonderful. The Moon's a Balloon, etc. But this is The Fancy Dress Ball, and this is while he was in the army. The other boredom reliever of those last 12 months was the fancy dress ball in the Opera House. It was a predictable show. Admirals dressed as Pierrots, their wives as Columbines. Bo-peeps were plentiful, and there was a sprinkling of Old Bills and Felix the Cats among the military. Parties took boxes in the lovely tiered building, and everyone tried hard to pretend that it was every bit as gay and abandoned as the Chelsea Arts Ball. Trubshaw and I went as goats. First, we put noisome rugs on our backs. Then horns on bands were fixed to our heads. And finally, between our legs, for the goat fittings, footballs, soccer balls, swung with rubber gloves sewn onto them by the regimental cobbler. Half a pint of dry martinis apiece, and we were ready for the fray. We arrived just in time for the Grand March, for the prize giving. The judges for the best costumes were on the stage, and round in front of them, 2 by 2, like the animals going into the ark, went the clowns with their red-hot pokers, the ballet dancers, and the Mickey Mice. Rumblings of disapproval rose from the boxes as the 2 drunken goats joined in at the back of the parade. Trubshaw, Niven, goats, bad show, damn bad show. Military mustaches and naval eyebrows bristled from every floor. "I'm getting dizzy, old man," said the goat behind me after we'd completed several circuits. "Left wheel." Obediently, I turned out of the parade towards the empty center of the floor. "Now squat," commanded Trubshaw. "What?" I asked apprehensively. Squat, you bloody fool. So there, at the very hub of the wheel, with a kaleidoscope of colour circling round us and the focus of hundreds of disapproving eyes, I squatted. Trubshaw produced a brown paper bag from the folds of his smelly rug and sprinkled black olives on the floor directly behind me. Except in the box that held David Kilburn and Athley Playdell Bouverie, this flourish was coldly received by the ticket holders, particularly by a party of Maltese students who had a very short fuse when they thought that someone was mocking the local institutions. They jostled and shoved us as we left the floor and made threatening noises. "Better take off, old man," said my leader as he headed for the exit. And the last I saw of Trubshaw that night, he was pounding down the main street of Valletta toward the sanctuary of the Union Club, pursued by the hornet students and tripping over his udders. And now... Oh, yes, sorry about this. All right. By John Payne Collier, The Serious Misconduct of Coleridge's Wife. Coleridge came to Rose, this is Hugh James Rose, 1795 to 1838, classical scholar and theologian. He came to Rose one day early, obviously in great trouble. He sat down without saying a word, and tears even began to flow down his cheeks. Rose inquired earnestly what was the matter, what was weighing upon his mind. But for some time he could get no answer. At last, Coleridge told him he was come to consult him about something relating to the conduct of his wife. Rose was startled, yet he could not think that she had been guilty of any serious misconduct, and told him so. Coleridge answered that what she had done, if he yielded to it, would embitter the rest of his life. Rose was alarmed and besought Coleridge to tranquilize himself and to tell him what had happened. He hinted a hope that it was nothing affecting her moral character as a wife. "Oh, no," said Coleridge, "nothing of that kind. But it's something that I cannot think of without the deepest pain." "Well," said Rose, "let us hear it. Perhaps it is not so bad as you at this moment consider it." "I came to you," added Coleridge, "as a friend and a clergyman, to ask you what I ought under the circumstances to do." "Let me have the circumstances," rejoined Rose, "and then I may be better able to judge. Calm yourself." Again Coleridge wiped his large gray eyes and went on to apologize for the trouble he was giving. Rose assured him that his main trouble was to see a friend so unhappy, and after beating about the bush for some time longer, Coleridge declared that he could never live with his wife again if she were not brought to her senses. Rose here began to fear that Mrs. Coleridge had literally gone out of her mind, but Coleridge reassured him upon that head, adding, however, that a sane woman could hardly have required of her husband what she had expected from him, viz., that on the coldest mornings, even when the snow was on the ground and icicles hanging from the eaves of their cottage, she compelled him to get out of bed in his nightshirt and light the fire before she began to dress herself and the baby. And now by David Herbert, The Reverend So-and-so Dismissed. During the last war, I inherited Boynton Manor, after the death of my cousin, Sidney Herbert. The local clergyman was a drunkard, and the parishioners longed to get rid of him. The only possible way would be if he would be caught drunk in the pulpit, but he was far too cunning to fall into that trap. As he got older, I suppose he had less willpower, and I received this message from our representative when I was in Australia, where my ship was in dock. Glad to inform you, the Reverend so-and-so dismissed. Last Sunday he got up in the pulpit and shouted, "On your knees, you bitches and buggers!" I'll get there. I'm leaving you to savor that one. Now, Two Cousins. This is by David Herbert. My cousin, Lady Ursula Talbot, would have been a beauty but for her nose, which was so big that it seemed to enter a room long before the rest of her. Because of this defect, she was painfully shy, rarely spoke, and was a wallflower at every debutante dance. Eventually, she could bear it no longer, and unbeknownst to her parents, had it chopped off, and a little retroussé nose took its place. After this operation, she never looked back. She had 3 husbands, and between the second and third, lived with a well-known English writer for many years. Sadly, she was killed in a private plane, piloted by her third husband, over the Scilly Isles. Another cousin of mine was Dorothy Paget, daughter of Lord Queensborough. She was remarkably plain, and what made it worse, she had a beautiful sister, Alhed, Lady Bailey, of Leeds Castle. Poor Dorothy had skin like a ploughed field, an underhung lower lip, mousy, rather thin hair, and she became enormously fat. Her saving grace was that she was destined to become very rich. When she came of age, she inherited a vast fortune, which made her independent. She was able to lead the eccentric life she chose by turning night into day. Buying racehorses was her one passion, but she was seldom seen on the racecourse, except if one of her horses was running in a particularly important race. Otherwise, she relied on the wireless, as it was then called, for the results of her racing activities. She was surrounded by ruthless sycophants who, for what they could get out of her, also turned their nights into days. What they didn't know was that she was fully aware of their goings-on, but put up with them because it gave her a sense of power, which, in a way, compensated for her inferiority complex. Her money was in trust, so they inherited nothing. Dorothy never married, and to my knowledge had no lovers, male or female. She died when she was still quite a young woman. And now this is by John Mortimer, whom you will recognize as the author of Rumpole of the Bailey. And it's entitled Mistresses and Murderers. Both my father and I were guilty of infidelity to the law. My mistress was writing. His was the garden. He would break off conferences to get an early train, change his clothes, and do a tour of the plants he couldn't see but could only smell before the light faded, and my mother would no longer be able to describe the budding of the camellias or the blousy attraction of the dahlias. The house and garden acted like a drug on him. The place was a Circe's island from which he found it harder and harder to escape. In time, I also found myself less and less willing to leave it, to cover my head with itchy horsehair and put on a stiff winged collar, to bow to someone for whom I felt no particular respect and say, if your lordship pleases, and to fight over and over again the same battles to save some client from being treated according to his just deserts. But then, as Hamlet said, use every man after his desert, and who should escape whipping? Not, of course, that every fight was the same. The reasons for getting into trouble are the subject of infinite variation, from mere bad luck to the existence of evil. The Old Bailey was a mixture of the theater of comedy, of tragedy, of the absurd and the macabre, and most often a drama in which these styles were alarmingly intermingled, as they were in the case of the murderous butler, a killer who, I was told, hoped to make the Guinness Book of Records on account of the number of persons he had done to death. In my childhood, I remember my parents engaged a manservant, a tall fellow with crinkly hair who wore a grubby white mess jacket which revealed the ends of his braces, called Treadgold. He used to ask me to go out on the common and bowl cricket balls at him, an invitation which filled me with fear. The butler in my Old Bailey case was pale, courteous, and dignified. He had read a little law and discovered that in Scotland they had something that appealed to him greatly, a verdict of not guilty, or not proven, excuse me. Yeah, that's in Scotland. There's guilty, not guilty, and not proven. So he would drive his victims to Scotland, bury them on some barren heath, and if they were discovered, he hoped to take advantage of this ambiguous Scottish finding. He had been the butler of a very elderly ex-Labour MP who was no longer perfectly in his right mind. Having killed his employer's wife, the butler offered to drive the old man, who was quite unaware of the tragedy which had occurred, to the Odeon cinema in Leicester Square to see a nice travel film. His victim saw no film, but instead was driven to Scotland, and there, beside a Highland stream, he was murdered. Working for a county lady, the butler was recognized by her footman as someone he had met during a spell in prison. For this, the footman was killed and buried in the rose garden. Later, the lady in question wrote to the court to assure the judge that the butler was an absolute paragon who never failed to take the Labrador out each night for a run in the rose garden. I didn't act for this tail-coated assassin, but for another footman who had been his accomplice. My client, I remember, complained that the butler was treated as a star in prison, enjoying the sort of deference which screws and fellow inmates according to such famous figures as the Cray twins, whereas he was treated with contempt and often had scalding cocoa poured over his head. At the end of the trial, the judge sentenced the butler to life imprisonment, from which you will never be released unless you are in the terminal stages of a fatal illness. At this, the perfect servant smiled faintly, bowed, and left the dock, as though he had been told that he might serve dinner now. The most terrible crimes often take place in mundane surroundings, and the evidence is commonplace. The story of one of the first murders I was concerned with started with a cleaning lady employed by a very upper-class agency, let us say Dusters Limited of Kensington. She was sent off to clean the Belgravia apartment of a family she had never met and was given the keys to let herself in. Accordingly, she went to this select address, walked into the kitchen, took off her coat and hat, and hung them neatly in a cupboard. She put on her coverall, found the Hoover, and emerged in a long passage, at the end of which she saw a young man, who was to be my client, in the act of murdering his mother, with a weapon which was referred to during the trial as a salad knife. Without a moment's hesitation, the cleaning lady returned to the kitchen, closed the door firmly, put away the hoover, took off her overall, put on her hat and coat, and returned to the offices of Justice Limited. When asked why she had come back so soon, she shook her head and said, "No, that's not really the type of family I'd care to work for." She told no one about the killing, which was not in fact discovered until a considerable time later. When the son was arrested, however, the statement he made to the police came out as a kind of lurid poetry, for he said, "I have either buggered a prostitute or killed a peacock in paradise." This may have been a lightning flash of lunacy or a well-contrived invention to get him to where he was destined to go, to Broadmoor. Sometimes the plots of the dramas in which we took part might have been written on a day when his fancy was running riot by Joe Orton. Two young male prostitutes were standing under neighboring lampposts in Bayswater, and they struck up an acquaintance. Their names were Bob and Anthony. Bob was inclined to rob anyone who went home with him, and Anthony was in the process of changing his sex. These two fell head over heels in love. Bob took his new friend, by now known as Antoinette, to live with his parents. Bob's father was a prison warder, a job which provided him with a house, and Bob's mother, overjoyed that her son had found a nice girlfriend at last, hoped for an early marriage. For a while, all went well, but then Antoinette began to stray and took to visiting the Flying Saucer Club in Leicester Square. One night, Bob, overcome with jealousy, followed her to this resort, where he found Antoinette removing her trousers while dancing with a young man. Enraged, Bob began to beat his friend about the head with a pink plastic piggy bank in which the club collected money for an annual children's outing. As a result of this attack, Antoinette was fatally injured, and the police were sent for. During the course of his questioning, Bob said to the inspector in charge of the case, "Have you got any idea what it's like to fall in love with a bloke who changes his sex, and you take him to live with your mum and dad, and then find him undressing on the dance floor of the Flying Saucer and making you so mad you hit him with a piggy bank?" To which the inspector politely replied, "No, sir, I can't say as I have ever had such an experience." At the trial, the judge said he was going to treat the case as a perfectly ordinary, run-of-the-mill matrimonial dispute. Bob was found guilty of manslaughter by reason of provocation and leniently treated. The reactions of judges at the Old Bailey were a source of continual surprise. There was also a trial in which I got a startling insight into the home life of one particular, his lordship. I had a run of cases which arose from quarrels between married couples in bathrooms. Indeed, the shared bath is fraught with dangers for parties with cooling marriages. The situation in which they find themselves often gives rise to comments of a wounding and personal nature. One such dispute had led to an attempted drowning, for which the husband was arrested, and I was hard put to it to formulate a defense. Before the trial, the judge asked us to his room for coffee and biscuits and a discussion of its probable length. He looked at me as though I was personally in the habit of drowning women in baths, and said that it was a most terrible and serious case. "Indeed it is, my lord," I told him. My client was seated at the tap end of the bath, He foolishly lost his temper when his wife adversely compared his physical prowess to that of her lover. What did you say? The judge looked at me aghast. I said she had made a comment of a personal nature, which led to a violent quarrel, I repeated, and added, I'm afraid the fight started when he was sitting at the tap end of the bath, and the tap end! By now the judge was seriously perturbed. Does the prosecution accept this evidence? Yes, my lord. Counsel for the Crown admitted it cheerfully, not being altogether sure what was going on. How long had he been in the habit of sitting at the tap end of the bath? The judge asked in some distress. Throughout the marriage, his wife required him to sit in that position so he could rinse her hair after she'd shampooed it. And how long had they been married? About 20 years, I had to tell him. For 20 years, this woman required her husband to sit at the tap end, the judge repeated, and bit quite savagely into a digested biscuit. And so it went on, and we were bound over to keep the peace, or pleaded guilty to common assault, before a judge whose wife had always sat, apparently without complaint, with her naked shoulders pressed against the taps. Eventually, I did include this incident in the story, and no one thought it other than an extravagant invention. Rewriting what went on at the Old Bailey as fiction is a constant process of calming down the truth so that it may achieve some degree of credibility. And there we are, my dears. That's it for tonight, with a bit of a potpourri for you. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And I will look for more things to hopefully please you next Wednesday. Thank you so much. Good night for now.